Edo, Japan, a samurai could kill someone for insulting him, but drawing his sword just once could also destroy the samurai's own life. Movies and the internet usually tell only the first half of that story. The right is commonly known as Ki-risu-te Gomen. Its meaning sounds almost like the perfect title for a horror film. Cut them down. Leave them there. Be forgiven. But the real rules came with a second half that people rarely mention. If the samurai could not justify what he had done, he might be the next person to lose everything. And this is not even the most surprising story from Edo, Japan. We remember the Edo period as an age of peace. The samurai wars had ended. Great cities grew. Kabuki and ukiyo-e flourished. That peace was real, but violence did not disappear. When the sword went back into its sheath, power picked up the brush. It wrote status into registers, bound family debts into contracts, verified religious affiliation through certificates, and forced a distant kingdom to perform the role of an independent nation. Edo, Japan did not abolish coercion when it ended the wars. It reorganized coercion through law and status, contracts and surveillance and diplomacy. What follows is not simply a list of 10 bizarre customs. These are 10 far more sophisticated systems of control, built to preserve order in a peaceful society. Number 10. The samurai's license to kill. The practice, now better known as Ki-risu-te Gomen, appeared in contemporary records as burei uchi, killing in response to a grave act of disrespect. On the surface, it sounds exactly like the legend. If a person of lower status seriously dishonored a samurai, the samurai could use his sword. But this was not a blank check to cut down anyone he disliked. The offense had to be genuinely serious, and the response had to be immediate, on the spot. Going home, fetching a sword, and returning for revenge was not an act of honor. It was a crime. Afterward, the samurai had to explain why he had drawn his blade. If his reason was not accepted as legitimate, he could lose his status and property or face punishment himself. In 1742, the shogunate's legal code formally regulated the practice for the first time. It did not give samurai a new license to kill. It was an attempt by the state to control who could exercise legitimate violence. In the end, this right empowered the samurai, while also setting a trap for him. If he swallowed an insult, he could look like a coward. If he drew his sword, he risked his entire life. Samurai honor did more than create a right to kill other people. It also created pressure to commit junshi, to follow one's lord into death when that lord died. The shogunate banned the practice in 1663. Even after the ban, cases in which retainers carried out junshi could bring severe punishment upon the surviving family. To preserve peace, the shogunate demanded honor from the samurai, but it would not allow that honor to run wild on its own terms. The problem was that not everyone received the same chance as a samurai to explain what they had done. Number 9. The society where your neighbors had to prove who you were. For a resident of Edo period Japan, a Buddhist temple was more than a place to pray. From the mid-17th century onward, although the details varied by time and place, many residents were entered into religious and population registers tied to Buddhist temples. One of the most important things those records confirmed was this: you are not a Christian. A temple certificate was not exactly the same as a modern identity card, but it could affect marriage, travel, recognition as a member of the community, and even whether you received a funeral after death. A single sheet of paper effectively certified not only your religion, but your right to exist within society. Then came the gonin gumi. This system generally grouped around 5 households together and made them collectively responsible for taxes, crimes, prohibited religions, and suspicious behavior. Imagine it. You have committed no crime, but the family next door has fled to avoid taxes or hidden a forbidden faith. At that moment, it is no longer just your neighbor's problem. Your neighbor became someone you were expected to help, and someone you were expected to watch. The shogunate did not need an official stationed in every alley. It only had to make neighbors police one another, and these temple registers will return later. In story number 2, they become part of a vast net designed to uncover the faith hidden in people's hearts. But when registers and a neighbor's testimony could not establish a crime, officials looked for the answer in the human body. Number 8. The trial that did not end until you confessed. Edo criminal justice was not a lawless torture chamber with no evidence and no procedure. There were investigative procedures. Evidence and testimony were examined, nor was torture automatically used in every case. But to complete a conviction for a serious crime, the defendant's confession was crucial. The problem came when the evidence pointed to one person, and that person continued to deny everything. At that point, the goal of the investigation could shift from discovering the truth to making the person already under suspicion speak that truth himself. Piling heavy stones on a prisoner's knees, constricting the body with ropes, or suspending a bound suspect were regulated as official methods of interrogation. Torture was not a mistake outside the law. It was a tool that could be used under conditions defined by the law itself. Edo punishment lists also retained nokojiri biki, the punishment of sawing. The condemned person was buried with only the neck exposed above the ground, and a saw was placed beside them. From that description, it can sound as if every passing citizen took a turn with the saw. There is no evidence that this happened repeatedly everywhere in Japan. By the late Edo period, there were also symbolic versions in which the condemned was put on public display beside a blood-stained saw, then executed by another method. The actual method and frequency of enforcement varied by period and region. But what truly mattered was not only how many times the saw moved, it was the fear that the name and image of the punishment created in people's minds. The law did not merely kill a criminal, it showed the entire society what destruction could look like when someone challenged those in power. And, ironically, the people who managed execution grounds and handled the dead were the very people society desperately needed and pushed furthest away. Number 7. The people everyone needed and no one wanted near them. Edo Japan had distinct lower status groups known at the time as Eita and Hinin. Today, those names are treated as discriminatory historical terms. They should not be imagined as one identical group. Their composition and status varied by region, occupation, and method of registration. Some made leather, disposed of animal carcasses, managed execution grounds, and removed human remains. These were essential jobs in any society that wanted to preserve cleanliness and order. But because they worked with death, blood, and leather, they were treated as if they themselves were polluted. Some were entered into separate registers, restricted to particular areas, and sometimes distinguished by their clothing or hairstyle. They were not invisible within society. They were people classified and recorded with brutal clarity. This was the cruelest contradiction. They were not excluded because their work was inherently dirty. Society assigned them the work it considered dirty, then used that very work as the reason to exclude them. After 1868, the old status labels were legally abolished, but the stigma embedded in registers, neighborhoods, marriages, and occupations did not disappear overnight. A scar made by a record outlived one made by a sword. And the practice of binding a person's fate to paper did not end with status registers. In Edo's most dazzling district, contracts did the same thing. Number 6. The women's contracts hidden behind the glamour. Yoshiwara looks dazzling in ukiyo-e, elaborate kimono, trend-setting hairstyles, high-ranking courtesans skilled in poetry and music. Like modern celebrities, their clothes and gestures shaped fashion across the city. Yoshiwara was more than a licensed prostitution district. It was also a vast stage where Edo's fashion, publishing, and performing arts intersected. But step outside the picture and open the contract, and the mood changes completely. Poor families received an advance payment when they sent a daughter to a pleasure quarter. On paper, she was going to work for a fixed period. In reality, she could not simply leave by her own choice. She had to work off the advance and the various costs attached to it. But clothing, makeup, training, and living expenses could all be added back onto the debt. The contract might have an end date. The debt might not. Of course, not every woman entered Yoshiwara in the same way, and not every woman lived the same life. Life differed enormously between the highest-ranking courtesans and women at the bottom. Some completed their contracts, returned to their families, or began new lives. But a handful of success stories do not change the core of the industry. This was a cultural space that sold romance, and a vast market that profited by binding women's labor and sexuality to debt. Beneath the dazzling lights, what truly changed hands were people and debt. Edo men portrayed courtesans as symbols of the floating world, but the women inside that world were not free to float away. Violence had changed into the language of a contract, and now the story descends even deeper. The most terrible choice made by a poor family did not end with sending a daughter to a pleasure quarter. Number 5. The children who never entered the register. Ma-biki. Originally, it was an agricultural term for thinning seedlings that had grown too densely in a field or rice paddy. But in some parts of Edo Japan, the word became a euphemism for abortion and infanticide. People did not say they had killed an unwanted newborn. They said the child had been sent back. But even that phrase often left no trace in the actual registers. A child who died before the first registration never entered the record at all. The child's death remained not as a recorded event, but as a gap in the record. It would be wrong to present this as a universal practice across all of Japan. There were major differences across periods and regions. One study reconstructing population registers from more than 1,000 villages in eastern Japan points to a disturbing possibility. In certain places and periods, abortion and infanticide may have affected as many as 4 out of every 10 pregnancies. This is not a nationwide figure, nor is it a simple count of infanticides written plainly into the registers. It is a regional estimate reconstructed from demographic records. Families did not make these choices simply because they did not want children. Land was limited. Taxes and crop failures returned again and again. There might not be enough food even for the children already alive. The number of sons, the number of daughters, and even the spacing between births entered a household's calculation for survival. Yet, this cannot be reduced to something poverty simply made unavoidable. Even at the time, monks and intellectuals condemned mabuki as murder. Some domains, worried about population decline, offered money and grain to encourage childbirth and child-rearing. Within the same society, some called it responsible family planning. Others called it killing a child. The most frightening part of that argument is not the number itself, nor is it that the registers recorded a lie. It is that when a life vanished before it entered the register, the record said nothing at all. There was no sword, no trial, no punishment. Simply by not being counted, a human existence disappeared. But no matter how carefully a family controlled its size, the calculation became useless when the sky and market collapsed at the same time. Number 4. The rice that kept moving while people starved. The Great Tenmei Famine of the 1780s was one of the worst disasters of the Edo period. In the Northeast especially, cold weather, relentless rain, and repeated crop failures devastated agriculture. The eruption of Mount Asama in 1783 added another shock to a society already coming apart. Villages emptied. Bodies were left beside the roads. Records even describe people eating human remains in the extremity of starvation. Shogunate population counts show that Japan's population fell by roughly 920,000 between 1780 and 1786. But that number should not be read entirely as famine deaths. It also reflects fewer births, migration, and the limitations of the count itself. Even so, the scale of the shock to Japanese society is unmistakable. But natural disaster alone cannot explain why some regions collapsed far more horribly than others. Rice was food. It was also tax, political power, and a traded commodity. In some regions, grain continued to flow outward to meet tax obligations and generate cash income, while reserves remained inadequate. Even while people starved, the rice kept moving. As harvests failed, rice prices surged. Anger turned toward grain merchants and wealthy households that still had supplies. In 1787, disturbances targeting rice dealers and merchants erupted in Edo and other cities. This was not the uprising led by Ukiyo-e Hachiro during the Tenpo famine half a century later. The Tenmei famine did not end with one heroic rebellion. Across the country, starving people moved toward warehouses and markets all at once. The weather may have started the hunger, but institutions and markets decided who ate first, who waited longest, and who ultimately starved to death. This is not a simple conspiracy story in which the shogunate secretly hid all the rice. It is a story about how the same natural disaster could kill people very differently when it met a rice-based tax system, grain distribution networks, inadequate reserves, and unequal relief across regions. If rice was power in Japan's heartland, fish was power in the northern seas. Number 3. The Ainu anger that exploded in Japan's north. In the late 18th century, Ezo, today's Hokkaido and the southern Kuril Islands, was not yet the fixed Japanese borderland we imagine today. Ainu communities lived there with their own languages, trading networks, and beliefs. The Matsumae domain controlled trade with the Ainu. Over time, trading rights were subcontracted to merchants, and merchant-run fisheries drew increasing numbers of Ainu into cheap labor. The Ainu were being transformed from independent trading partners into labor entries in a merchant's ledger. Resentment accumulated over unfair trade, forced labor, beatings, and sexual exploitation. In 1789, an uprising finally erupted in the Kunashi-ri and Manashi regions. Alongside the merchants' abuse, suspicion that sake offered during a loyalty ritual had been poisoned added to the anger. But the poisoning was an allegation made at the time, not a confirmed fact. The Ainu killed more than 70 Japanese people. The uprising was soon suppressed, and 37 Ainu identified as ringleaders were executed. Their heads were displayed as a warning. This is not a story of people who simply endured abuse without resistance. The Ainu fought back. They planned. They took up weapons. They struck at the system, exploiting them. Significantly, after the investigation, the merchant family at the center of the abuses lost its trading rights. Even those in power understood that abuse had helped cause the uprising. But replacing one operator did not end the system itself. In the records of the shogunate and Masumahe, this could be reduced to unrest on the frontier. Shift the point of view, and a very different scene emerges. A system called trade delivered profits to one side and imposed control and labor on the other. That imbalance finally exploded. Japan went on to impose increasingly direct control over Ezo. But this was not a story of developing empty land. It was a story of a national border descending over the land, labor, and language of people who already lived there. A story that began with one person has now expanded to encompass an entire people. And in the final two stories, control reaches into the human mind and into the identity of an entire kingdom. Number 2. The people forced to step on the face of Jesus. By the early 17th century, Japan already had a significant population of Christian converts. The shogunate saw the religion not simply as a private faith, but as a political threat that might connect its followers to foreign powers. In 1614, Christianity was banned across the country. Missionaries were expelled, and believers became targets for arrest and punishment. The most famous tool used to find them was the fumi-e. A tablet bearing an image of Christ or the Virgin Mary was placed on the ground, and people were ordered to step on it, and suspicion could be lifted. Refuse, and you could be identified as a Christian, leading to interrogation, imprisonment, torture, and punishment. The temple registers and neighbors' testimony we saw earlier now became a vast net. The question was not, what do you believe? It was, can you deny it in front of everyone? Imagine it. To stay alive, you must place your foot on the face of the God you worship. Step down, and it feels like a betrayal of your own heart. Refuse, and your life and your family's safety are at risk. Your entire life rests on a single step. Some refused. Some stepped on the image to survive. And some stepped on the sacred image with their feet, then went home and prayed again. These were the kakure kirishitan, the hidden Christians. In communities where priests had vanished, families and village leaders passed down baptisms, prayers, and holy days. Christian symbols were concealed within Buddhist and Shinto forms. Latin and Portuguese prayers changed across generations into sounds whose meanings were increasingly difficult to understand. More than 2 centuries passed this way. In 1865, residents of Urakami approached Oura Church in Nagasaki. They told a French priest that they, too, had preserved the same faith. It was the moment a community sustained without priests or publicly available Bibles revealed itself to the world. But the persecution did not end that day. The ban on Christianity was not officially lifted until 1873. The fumi failed to erase belief completely. Instead, it forced belief to evolve into an invisible form. The quietest violence was the demand that a person step on their own heart. And now, we need to reconsider one of the most famous words associated with Edo Japan. Sakoku, the closed country. But Japan was never completely closed. Nagasaki connected Japan to China and the Dutch. Tsushima connected it to Korea. Matsumae connected it to the Ainu world. And Satsuma connected it to Ryukyu. Japan did not lock every door. It left a few doors open and handed the keys to selected powers. And sometimes, the people holding those keys even altered the substance of diplomacy itself. As relations severed by Toyotomi Hideyoshi's invasions of Korea were being restored, the Tsushima domain forged diplomatic documents on both the Japanese and Korean sides. Forgeries were involved even in the state letters carried by Korean diplomatic missions in 1607 and 1617. The astonishing part is not simply that the documents were fake. It is that they were accepted as real diplomatic documents and helped set relations between the two countries in motion again. Edo diplomacy was not isolation. It was connection under strict management. But in the south, a performance far greater than a forged letter was already underway. Number 1. The kingdom forced to pretend it was independent. In the seas south of Japan stood the Ryukyu kingdom. It possessed its own languages and culture and had prospered as an intermediary in East Asian maritime trade. In 1609, the Satsuma domain invaded Ryukyu. The Ryukyuan king was captured and taken to Japan, and the kingdom fell under Satsuma's political and economic control. Normally, this is where the conqueror would abolish the kingdom and declare it Japanese territory. But Satsuma did the exact opposite. It made Ryukyu continue to look like an independent foreign country. The reason was China. For centuries, Ryukyu had sent tribute missions to Chinese dynasties, received investiture, and conducted trade. If Japanese rule became too obvious and disrupted that relationship, Satsuma's commercial gains would also be at risk. So the king remained. Ryukyuan always continued to travel to China. The kingdom's diplomatic rituals continued. But behind the stage, Satsuma was at work. Ryukyuans were ordered not to reveal Japanese-style names, clothing, or customs. When Chinese investiture envoys arrived in Ryukyu, Satsuma officials disappeared from view. Even answers to questions about Ryukyu's relationship with Japan were managed. Plans were even prepared to show the envoys a different village. If they demanded to see the settlement where Japanese residents were being hidden, an entire country had become a diplomatic stage set. On stage, Ryukyu was an independent state with its own king and diplomacy. Behind the scenes, Satsuma controlled taxation, trade, and major political decisions. However, we cannot assume that the Chinese side knew nothing about this arrangement. Some Chinese officials and envoys appear to have suspected or known about Japanese influence over Ryukyu. But it was also convenient for China not to challenge that reality officially. Nor was Ryukyu merely a completely passive puppet. Even within a system imposed upon them, Ryukyuan officials exploited the contradictions between China and Japan to preserve a limited degree of autonomy. That does not mean all three powers benefited equally. Satsuma gained control and commercial profit. China preserved a familiar tributary order. Ryukyu had to negotiate for room to survive inside conditions created by invasion. This was stranger than simple occupation. The ruler did not erase the kingdom's identity. It preserved and performed that identity whenever useful. The Ryukyuan people lived under Japanese domination while being required to appear non-Japanese. The performance continued for a time even after the Edo period ended. But as the modern nation-state demanded one border and one sovereignty, the stage was dismantled. In 1879, the Japanese government abolished the Ryukyu kingdom and established Okinawa Prefecture. The kingdom's official disappearance did not take long. But for nearly 270 years, it had lived under Japanese rule while being required to look like an independent country. The samurai's sword, the temple certificate, the status register, the debt contract, the sacred image people were forced to step on, and the kingdom forced to perform its own independence. The order of Edo Japan operated in places far quieter than a battlefield. War truly did decline. Cities grew. Commerce and culture flourished. But the power that maintained order did not disappear. It moved from swords to certificates, from battlefields to contracts, from castle walls to village registers. And the cost was not charged equally to everyone. These are not secrets that Japan burned and erased from history. Much of this history was uncovered, studied, and brought before the public by Japanese historians themselves. What was hidden was not the record itself. It was our habit of compressing the Edo period into a single word, peace. Edo's peace was real. So was the price someone had to pay to maintain it. And the people who remembered that peace most beautifully were often not the people who paid its price.